A lot of people spend their life satisfied by delusion and mired in crisis. They spend a lot of time devoting their life to religion or things which essentially conjure an equivalent sense of fervor and faith. So they spend their life feeling like they're busy. They're busy chasing something that needs to be chased. Maybe it's the Mormons going door to door trying to spread the good news and give a few more books of Mormon to their neighbors. Or maybe it's people at campaign time trying to go door to door to convince members of their community of who should be voted for in the next election. Or maybe you work for a snack company and you spend your days trying to convince people to buy pretzels. It takes a lot of different forms, but we are pretty good at finding ways to be busy. And there's nothing wrong with having things that you're doing in life. It's just sometimes those things we do to try to give ourselves a sense of higher purpose are actually pretty pointless. There's a lot of people who would tell you that if you like to play video games, you're wasting some element of your life. But those same people will often believe in things which are unproven or simply false. I began my life with an avid sense of faith. I was profoundly Christian. And I believed that the Bible was the immutable Word of God. I was passionate about wanting to go into some form of service, to be a missionary or a preacher, something like that. And I truly believed. And in a lot of ways, it made my life better, because it helped me to get through certain things in my early childhood, having a sense of faith. And along with faith comes the religious teachings of allegory, which are very powerful. To this day, the stories of the words of Jesus and a lot of the things that you'll find written in the Bible are laden with a lot of amazing and timeless life lessons. But as time went on, I faced the reality, which is that the Bible does not offer any concrete proof that it's the Word of God. And God is, at least as Christians think of God, completely silent in the affairs of mankind. We can find the voice of God everywhere in the form of people who are representing what they think God wants. But to actually find God representing himself, speaking for himself, well, there's people who will tell you that God works miracles. But if you really are honest, faith is not something which we can prove. So, not because I was trying to rebel against faith, I still kept faith in my life. Not because I didn't want to believe, but because there simply was no proof for the believing. I had to surrender the things that I started my life believing in. And I kept the things which I thought were meaningful and the things which seemed to be timeless and true. But I gave up the things which I couldn't prove. Because no matter how good it sounds, no matter how much I want to believe, I can't in good conscience spend my life devoting it to a lie. So I kept many of the forms of Christian faith, but gave up much of the substance of believing in it. And in many ways, my life was better because it opened up a world of possibilities to think about things, to ask questions, to have an open mind to every part of life. And yet, an innocence was lost because when you give up having something to blindly believe in, you're taking one step closer to oblivion. To pull back the curtain and start to realize that life as you knew it doesn't have any meaning. Or at least it doesn't have the type of meaning that you once thought it did. So I went into adult life and started to advance my career. I started to want a higher rank. I wanted a badge with more authority. And I thought, if I could work my way up in my organization, that would be meaningful, because as I moved up, I'd be surrounded by people who also loved their careers, loved the work that they did, and were professional people who were passionate about doing good in the world. But as I experienced life, again, my faith and blind optimism was shattered, because I realized that people everywhere fall prey to the same flaws and vices and troubles. And there is no career that you can have that's going to give a sense of core purpose to your life. To the contrary, I looked at people who were more successful than I was in their careers, and I came to the realization that they hated their lives, and they hated their coworkers, each other, and the jobs that they'd spent their life trying to obtain. That's not to say that I don't believe that the work I do is worth doing. It doesn't mean that I don't take pride in a day of labor well done. But again, I realized that trying to climb up the ladder by running aggressively on the treadmill of a major corporation is an empty quest that leads to an endless grind. And if you don't have purpose in your life, that's not going to give you purpose in your life. There was a time when I looked at romance and love through the lens of rose shaded glasses. I thought that life was about finding that one true love, that happily ever after Meg Ryan romance movie kind of experience. But then experience and observation shattered that by teaching me that people are naturally corrupt. They tend to be manipulative. They tend to be controlling. And while there are some relationships which work out well, quite often, even the people who do make it work suffer from relationships that bring them more anguish and fatigue than fulfillment and joy. I know people with overwhelmingly successful families and careers who are active in their churches. They have all of it: faith, family, finance, and you would think it would all come together as a perfect climax of joy and satisfaction. But those people, of all the people who I've known, tend to be the most unsatisfied, the most bitter, the most inclined to act like it's never enough, the most likely to be always on a treadmill reaching for something that they don't have, raging against things they can't change, and trying to control other people to shape them to their agenda. So you see, whether you're chasing a religion or a job or love, all of those things, I came to the realization, ring hollow. Because by chasing those things, it's like playing an MMO because you want to win at the end game. And what you never realized was that all of the things you could do to grind and level up your character and learn about the lore of the world are really not meaningless, because without them, the game wouldn't be what it is. But they by themselves are not enough to make you enjoy the game. Because if you can't learn to enjoy the game for the experience of the journey, there's not any single part of the game, any mechanic in the game, that's going to make it a joyful experience. Now, that leads me to the most recent chapter of my life. Finding myself alone, seeing the fruit of having spent a significant amount of time working on myself, working on all of those problems that had made my life difficult and added challenge in the past. And I got through a lot of it and reached a place where life was comparatively easy, relatively free of problems or things that I needed to worry about on a daily basis. And that was an interesting experience as well, because it made me realize that while we spend a lot of our lives perhaps buying into things which are delusions, which distract us and give us a sense of hope, because we're always grinding for something out of reach or buying into something that's a fantasy. So we don't think about the reality of our lives. We also spend a lot of our lives struggling kind of like people playing a PvP game competitively, where you never are able to really enjoy the scenery because you're always under fire. Every game is a competitive match, so you never really enjoy the ambience. You never really look at the design of the world. Somebody was talking about a new Halo game coming out and how the developers had been talking about how the trees are going to be rendered better and the foliage is going to look better. And that person said, whoever has played a first-person shooter on a basis of how good the foliage looks? And the answer is nobody. The point being, it's an action game. It's not really about that. So to use that as an allegory, when you're busy fighting, you really aren't going to focus on all of those small details of philosophy, allegory, and abstract thinking. You'll be too busy. So there you have it. We mostly spend our lives being so busy chasing fictions and thinking that they're all important and fighting problems like that revolving credit card debt or something of the nature of mischief we've gotten ourselves into. We never really get to a place where we're able to reach zero, to have peace and have tranquility in our lives. And I did get there. Not that anyone gets there perfectly or entirely, but I got there enough that I'm in that ballpark. And that's when I realized that peace, tranquility, serenity can just be another word for being lost, for being lonely, or for being depressed. Because quite often we don't know what to do when we reach a place where there's nothing really wrong and where we don't have comforting lies with which to comfort ourselves. And that leads me to this thought that someone very eloquently said. Birds wouldn't want to fly south if there was no south to go to. So I look back over all of the different things which have given my life a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, all those things that I've reached for, and maybe realized that they were falsehoods on some level. The fiction was shattered. But I've also realized that we wouldn't have a longing and a yearning for things if those things weren't in some way real and in some way possible. It's true that religious teachings are probably generally more fiction than they are literal truth. But that doesn't mean that we can't have a sense of faith anyway. Just like Santa Claus might not be a real person, but that doesn't mean that he can't still be a meaningful figure, especially in the heart of a child. Careers might be filled with corrupt people and corrupt corporations, and they might not live up to all the promise that you would hear on orientation day. But that doesn't mean that we can't celebrate the good that is done in the world as a result of our daily labors and the things that we do to invest in the economy and in society around us. And it's also true that happily ever after is quite often a fairy tale. And there are a lot of broken dreams out there, as well as a lot of fulfilled ones, which leave people feeling silently desperate and empty inside anyway. But that doesn't mean that true love never happens, because sometimes it does. Even if it doesn't happen for us, it happens for somebody sometimes. The point I'm getting at is that there's some drops in the RPG of life that are just really rare. And you might grind for your entire time in the game and never actually find them because they're just such rare drops. True love is probably one of them. Having work that you truly love at a very high level might be one of them. And having some sort of supreme spiritual knowledge to understand the secret ways of the world, well, I'm not sure if that's a drop that even exists, and yet we still look for it. The lesson there is the fact that something is rare or not proven doesn't mean that we shouldn't reach out for it. Just look at how mankind has reached into the perimeter of space, and perhaps one day we'll go out Star Trek style and find some foreign life on another planet, but we don't even know if that exists right now. And yet we see humanity continuing to reach out, continuing to imagine things, continuing to hope, and live life as if that hope were a thing that is real. Sometimes that's enough. Now, there are some problems that I think aren't really caused by us. We're just the victims of them. Problems like the way social media and technology has changed us in the 21st century. There really is no precedent for that. And as much as technology has been a blessing in our lives, it's also made it easier than ever to be fake and fickle in all of the wrong ways. It's easier than ever to disconnect from society, to be a person that has a persona which looks good and sounds good, but doesn't ever really deliver. And those are things probably for a different conversation. If there is any lesson there, it's to acknowledge that sometimes environmental factors are a major reason for why people do the things that they do, including each of us. But by the same measure, if we did want to criticize the problems of modern living, we also would have to put into perspective the fact that we have it much better than we probably ever had it before. Because I'd rather have the problems of the 21st century, things like the temptation to spend too much time on social media, or the problem that somebody you wanted to stay in touch with ghosted you. Well, those are not probably the worst problems to have when you compare them to things like enduring the superstition and lack of health codes and things that existed in the Middle Ages. If we went back in time, we'd probably come back with a newfound sense of appreciation for the major leaps forward that we've made. And we probably would return with much less criticism of the world we live in, the society that we live in. We'd probably realize that most of the problems we think are major big ticket issues of the day are pretty tame compared to the issues we faced long ago in the earlier days of our civilization. My point here being that there is a good reason to put an asterisk next to everything that I've just said and add the context that no matter how good or bad your life feels, there's a lot of measurable reasons for gratitude and causes to take stock of the blessings that you have in your life. And that leads me to this realization that life is all about the journey. It's not about the destination. Sometimes when we stop looking for things, that's when they come to us because we stop trying so hard. Sometimes when you stop looking for something perfect, that's when something good comes your way. But I think it's also important to take into consideration the fact that sometimes we do put our life too much on autopilot. Sometimes we do go too far down the path of saying, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so we just settle for something because it's good enough. And we stop reaching. But something inside us still challenges us and says, you should reach out because there's something more that you're meant to do in this life. And if you have that feeling, you should listen to it. You should reach a little bit out of your bubble, even if it's a comfortable, peaceful bubble, and find a way to make yourself open to the receiving of new blessings. And I think it is possible to have a sense of peace in your life, but also acknowledge that desire inside for your life to be evolving and changing, and leave room for that evolution to happen. Will it happen? I don't know. Maybe you just keep on grinding your whole life away and you never really find that promised land. Maybe somehow you help other people along your journey, and those players that are going to be playing the game after you're logged off for the last time have a better experience because they met you along the way, and that's how you contribute. Because, in a sense, we live vicariously through others when we improve the lives of others with whom we share our lives, and then they have a prosperous adventure of their own. But there's not a lot of reason to invest in others if you aren't first taking care of yourself. I think for a lot of us, we feel alone. We either feel alone because we are alone, or maybe we feel alone because it can be very easy to feel alone in a room filled with people who don't understand you, or who seem to actively undermine the feelings that you have about life. I think sometimes that it's worse to feel alone when you're in a relationship, or alone when you're in a crowd, because in those times you're not supposed to feel alone, because you're not alone. At least you can quantify that sense of loneliness when you're by yourself. You understand why you feel lonely, because you are alone. But when you're alone in a crowd, when you're alone with company, you don't even get that validation. You just have this feeling that something isn't right, despite the fact that by all measurable outward standards, you're supposed to be doing okay. So whether you feel alone because you are alone, or you feel alone just because there's something missing, the truth is you're not really alone, because there's a lot of us who are in that boat, or have been in that boat. And it's not a place you can't get out of, nor is it a place that you can't make peace with. And the solution is generally to make peace with it now, but remain open to the possibility that you're going to get out of it at some point. I do think you shouldn't do the same thing over and over again, though, and expect different results. And you should be open to making changes in your life, even if your life is pretty good. Because one of the things I've learned is that we tend to write ourselves off prematurely. We tend to think we've reached the end, many times long before the end actually comes. And one of my favorite examples of this is the life of Queen Elizabeth II. The Queen who began her career working with Winston Churchill during or right after the Second World War. And she was what many people would consider to be an old woman by the 70s. And she kept on carrying on and encouraging the people of her country and representing the crown for decades. Long after a lot of people would have probably written themselves off and said, well, the best years of my life are behind me. So, what if you write yourself off way too soon? What if you succumb to that idea of hopelessness, and then you don't do something that you totally could do because you think you're out of time? Then you fast forward another 10 or 20 years and you look back on right now and you say, wow, I wish I wouldn't have been so down in the dumps back then, because it turns out I had a lot more going for me than I realized at the time. I think boldness is something that we should all remind ourselves to have, because there's so many times we think, well, I should just take the safe path. And sometimes that's the best call, but sometimes maybe you should just change things up and do what you want to do, even if it's not the safest option. Because sometimes the greater risk lies in appeasement, in continuing to do what everyone wants you to do until you don't have any time or energy left to do what you were meant to do. As always, it's a lot to think about. But if you feel alone, remember you're not. And as always, good luck on your adventure.